Now, I want to do this by talking about one of the most recent episodes of the podcast. Last Thursday, I posted an episode with Neil deGrasse Tyson on the Piers Morgan show where he was talking about transgenderism and transgender athletes. And I thought his comments were very interesting, so I wanted to do a show on it, and I did that. Now, while most of the comments over the weekend about this show were totally fine, I did receive no small amount of backlash from what I guess is the deGrasse Tyson fan club, who knew that those guys, pulled out their bow ties and rolled so hard. Well, fortunately and unfortunately, they actually don't. I mean, I got comments like, this video is too long and this video is stupid. And I even got ridiculous takes about Christianity because I often bring up my faith within the context of critical thinking because I think it's important to be honest about who we are and what we think about these things. And I got people comparing Christianity to Egyptian mythology, Buddhism, and Hinduism. And I just... the point that these things are non sequiturs and logical fallacies to compare these things because they are falsely equivalent. Pushing that all aside, one of the most interesting comments I got was from a former student of mine. Now, I'm only pointing this out and using what this student said simply as an example of something much more broad, because certainly this student is very typical, not atypical in any way, but his comments very much so often look like the comments that I get on social media and on YouTube with the videos that I post from time to time. And they're far too common. So I think it's important to have a conversation about these things so that we can perhaps at least attempt to try to avoid kind of the logical fallacies and making some of the cardinal mistakes that we can make in disagreeing or having arguments or just even conversations with each other. If we're going to have healthy conversations, in other words, we need to just discuss what a healthy conversation looks like. So I'm going to bring up these comments and show you that we did have a little bit of a back and forth about a clip where I was discussing the definition of marriage and how we should define marriage. So here's that clip just for context real quick, and it's just 60 seconds long, so check it out. Everybody believes that there should be restrictions in marriage, even people on the radical left. We don't believe that we should be marrying child brides or marrying people to animals. Everybody believes in restrictions for marriage. The question is, where do we draw the line? And this brings up the broader context of Christian nationalism, because ultimately, if we believe that we're going to draw the line somewhere, the question then becomes, where do we draw the line? And I don't see any reason, no objective evidence, why we should draw the line using secular humanistic principles and not biblical principles. So even if you don't agree with me, you're still going to have to ask yourself the question, where could we draw a line that we can mutually agree upon that should be the basis for what we actually constitute marriage being? Okay, so as you can see, I'm merely just trying to say that if we're going to put restrictions on marriage, which should be an indisputable logical fact, most people believe that we should have restrictions on marriage, then it necessitates that we define marriage so that we know where those restrictions are. That's merely the argument I'm trying to make here. And I thought it was a pretty, argument-free thing to say that, hey, even if you don't agree with me, you probably agree with restrictions, so where do we draw those lines? And I'm saying I think that there's a reason that we can look to Scripture in order to define what marriage actually looks like, since it is one of the most ancient and reliable sources from whence we derive our understanding of marriage. Now, as uncontroversial as that may be, like I said, my student, a former student of mine that was only a student for about 6 months as I was subbing in a long-term fashion for a high school class and talking about history and economics with them. And I did so for a very short period of time, so I can't actually be blamed totally for this. But maybe I am to blame, because one of the things that I always tried to do was encourage my students, if they disagree, to disagree respectfully, but to give me a clear argument for why you disagree. And so I made disagreement very acceptable in my class. Now, while at times our conversations seemed disagreeable for the sake of disagreement, there is some things that I think are really, really important to point out, because I think that they really do serve as an example for what a healthy conversation doesn't look like and how it should look like. So without going into the comments, you could go there if you want to. And by the way, you should be following @ReedHuberman. If you're not, you can go there and look at them yourself. But essentially what I'd like to do is just take our final kind of discourse together and kind of just pick that apart to try to help you guys see what a healthy conversation looks like. And first and foremost, a healthy conversation looks contextual. You'll see if you look at the comments that I actually encouraged him to listen very carefully to what I'm saying, because I'm not saying that the state should be in the business of restricting homosexual marriage. I'm just simply stating that we must clearly define marriage. And the problem with not being contextual is that if you don't get the context of the conversation, you will never be able to understand the conclusion that is drawn from the conversation. But this happens all the time on social media. People either purposefully misunderstand or ignorantly misunderstand what is actually being stated because they're too quick to go to the keypad warrior mode and to try to slam dunk than they are to actually thoughtfully listen to what's being stated. Even when you disagree with a position, as long as it has some element of rational thought, you should pick apart those things that are rational. Find the best part of the argument and go to that and see if you can refute it, which is kind of the next part of what a healthy conversation looks like. A healthy argument or a healthy conversation should be logical. And the more indisputable the logic, the better. So my logic here that is pretty irrefutable is that heterosexual marriage produces something that homosexual marriage does not. If this was in the form of a syllogism, it might sound like this. Heterosexual relationships produce children, which is a societal good. Homosexual relationships do not procreate or reproduce children. Therefore, homosexual marriages lack an essential good that heterosexual marriages have. And so the idea here is just simply irrefutable logical argument that there is a scientific and biological reality that heterosexual couples possess that homosexual couples do not. And that biological reality actually is the replenishment and the repopulation of the human species, which is no small matter and is an intrinsic good to be able to continue the human race. And this is something that only heterosexual couples do. And so there is an intrinsic good to heterosexual unions over and above homosexual unions. So yes, biological sex does matter. In the conversation with my student, he said the gender of these people getting married shouldn't matter. Well, in the process of discussing marriage, I would think you might want to talk about some logical, undisputable facts that make up certain marriages but don't make up other marriages. Now, the third thing, and perhaps the most important thing, is that the argument has to be acceptable. So in other words, don't simply rely upon personal preference and opinion. You must make an argument that also is conferred by facts outside of your personal opinion. So in my conversation with the student, I said that stats tell us that heterosexual relationships are typically much more stable than homosexual ones. Now, this is kind of an aside, but there's probably a joke here. Bill Burr, in his latest comedy special, said something about homosexual relationships and made allusion to the fact that this is a true stat that lesbian relationships are way more unstable than almost any other relationship. Now, again, you'll have to go to the Bill Burr special to get exactly what that looks like.
Like, that's not your fault. You married a woman. I did it too.
Heterosexual relationships are much more cohesive than homosexual relationships. Now, my student brought up the fact, these stats are probably skewed because heterosexual relationships have been around longer than homosexual relationships. Well, in the actual study that I'm talking about, and I'll cite it for you here so that you can go look at it yourself. It is talking about modernity. It is talking about relationships that are happening presently. So whatever happened in the past has no bearing on these actual statistics here. And this is the weakest of all moves that most people do when they find inconvenient facts that don't suit their narrative or their argument, especially when it's statistics that are facts outside of themselves that should also be logical things that are indisputable. Now, I know stats aren't the whole picture, but obviously I also made other contextual arguments and logical arguments before bringing out statistical arguments. And so the dismissal of statistics as, well, they're just statistics, is merely a way to push away inconvenient realities that don't coincide with your argument. And this is something that I find all the time on social media. The moment you find any evidence to the contrary, you don't actually engage the evidence. You just say something like, oh, well, it must be skewed because it disagrees with me. I can't think of anything more modern than to say whenever anyone disagrees with you, they have to be wrong. And again, I bring all of this up because this is in no way about the student. This is not an isolated incident. This is the most kind of argumentation I find on the internet. It is purposefully misunderstood, almost always illogical, and completely based upon personal opinion rather than facts. This cannot be the way we discuss in a healthy society. Now, maybe I'm an idealist and I'm hardly going to be able to make a difference here, but maybe a word of caution will help. If you've never publicly, on a public platform with any following ever, expressed a coherent idea, especially one that might even just be slightly out of the mainstream, you should probably listen more and talk less. Hours of study and thought go into this show and other shows like mine. I've chosen the most difficult kind of show where I'm talking about philosophy and ideas and critical issues going on in society today. I mean, this is not fail army.
It's trying to headbutt me, bro.
My point is, when you've gone through the laborious process of deeply thinking, that is the best time to comment. Unless you have a question, and then if so, ask away. Otherwise, you run the risk of staring at the truth and making the seriously dangerous mistake of totally missing it. Now, for those who care about the truth, I also want to remind you of this. The truth is ridiculed, often opposed, and almost always misunderstood. This doesn't mean we stop talking. It doesn't mean that when we face resistance, we turn the other way and run. No, it only means we forge ahead all that much more strongly, past the thorns and past the critics who wish to sit back and critique and not actually enter the arena and do anything of value. Rather, they wish to be in their mother's basement, critiquing parenting while having no kids, shouting about Christianity and criticizing it when they've never actually read the whole Bible and certainly never studied it with any degree of critical analysis. These people generally suppose themselves to be way more clever than they actually are. And trust me, they'll go back to whatever Twitch channel they usually follow, and they'll vicariously live through the video game playing of somebody who's as equally socially awkward as they are. But I hope for better than that, and I have seen that on my show. That there are a group of people who want to join the adult table because they care about hashing out ideas in a mature fashion. Well, to be honest, I don't always do that, but come on, guys, I'm human, and I do have a little bit of sarcasm in me every once in a while. But for those who desire to take the journey of honest inquiry, I encourage you to have healthy conversations. I encourage you to have healthy arguments, and I encourage you to continue watching as we jump into the event sections of the event section of the show, where we'll talk about a very important topic, the rally to end childhood mutilation. And we'll talk about that today on Christianity Not Today. So you just got done watching a small excerpt of a much larger episode. You can find the link to that full episode down below in the description of this video. So you definitely need to check that out, because if you like that clip, you'll like the much larger episode. And while you're at it, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and click that little bell to be notified when great new episodes of Indie Thinker come your way. Thanks for watching.